من آقای سیاه مک یزدانفر رو هنرمند هستن. امشب افتخار دادن واقعا با همه کارهای زیادی که دارن و برای ما تایم گذاشتن. از ایست کوست با ما صحبت میکنن. That he has spent the last 7 years traveling to remote parts of Iran, capturing images of lesser known people and places of our motherland. His latest series of exhibition entitled Restless on a Hitta, and is an exploration of traditional clothing of a woman of Iran. He is recipient of 2021-2022 Artist Project Grant for Photography from Orange County Art Commission, the 2022-2023 Artist Project Grant for Photography, and again from the Orange County Art Commission, as well as Ella Fountain Pratt Emerging Artist Grant for Photography from Durham Art Council of Mary Du Biblel Foundation of Kelly Katzenmeyer Fund. He's joining us tonight, days before embarking on another series of photography expedition in Iran, beginning later this week. ایشون با همه کاری که دارن امشب به ما لطف کردن که چون مسافر هستن به ایران دوباره برای عکاسی‌های بیشتر، با همه کار زیادی که دارن لطف کردن و مهمون دعوت ما رو قبول کردن. یه ویدیوی 2 دقیقه‌ای از حرف خودشون که چه کاری میکنن میذاریم و بعد The Floor is Him و تمام داستان فوتوگرافی جاهای ناشناخته برای ماها رو برای ما توضیح میدم. خیلی ممنون. We'll just listen and see this little video. ممنون.
The annual saffron harvest in the hamlets of Segombat and Siyahdasht gave me the unique chance to pick, clean, and dry a few kilos of autumn crocus flowers alongside the villagers. During the latter half of 2020, I left the States and flew to the Middle East, back to my motherland. Traveling to distant places and exploring ways of life different than our own informs our worldview. We all seek familiarity, and I use the medium of photographic storytelling to deliver that. My name is Yazdanfar, and I'm a freelance photographer. What I would like to share with you are these adventures, undertaken while safely navigating travel in a world firmly in the grips of a pandemic. Arriving in Iran in late August began a whirlwind series of expeditions to far-flung corners of an oft-misunderstood country. I was fortunate enough to take part in pulling in nets and sorting out the catch alongside the Ardebili tribesmen whose livelihood depends on the bounty of a stressed and fragile ecosystem. My passages took me out to sea with piscators off the Caspian coast to document traditional fishing methods in Mazandaran province. The reward was a few grams of the crimson threads and snapshots of the assiduous work involved in producing this precious spice. Virtually every day of my extended trip brought new experiences, each steeped in Persian culture and traditions. From sipping chai at dawn amidst the millennia-old columns of Persepolis, the desert crossings on camelback, I was left in awe of the sights and the people for whom life continued, as it had for centuries. Long journeys such as this inspire me to be a better version of myself when I return from the trips. As our society opens back up, there is no better time to embrace our differences and similarities than now. With these images, I want to draw the viewers into a world poles apart and allow them to find comparisons with their own quotidian routines.
بسیار قشنگ. وبسایتشون رو ما روی فلایر نوشتم که اگر دوستان بعد دوست دارن که برن ببینن کارشون رو و یا باشون تماس داشته باشن بتونن این کار بکنن. و ویدیویی که امشب تهیه میشه روی یوتیوب خانه ایران خواهد بود اگه برای بعداً رفرنس داشته باشین. بفرمایید آقای یزدانفر. خواهش میکنم شروع کنید.
Salam Bahamagi. For the purpose of tonight's talk, if everybody's okay with it, I'll be conducting most of it in English, but we'll be happy to do the Q&A in different languages. So we can cast a wider net and break down some language and cultural barriers and spread this message among more people about our wonderful motherland. This is going to be a visually driven presentation, image heavy. So please bear with me while I begin this part of it. I've done other presentations with other cultural organizations, and with those, what we have done is we focus on particular projects, on particular sets of images. This one is more of a broad stroke, and the reason I pose it this way is because I want to explain a little bit about what I'm doing here. What I'm going to do with this presentation, my intention is to kind of give you an overview of how I put together these long-term projects, how I put together these continuing photographic expeditions in off the beaten path places where the infrastructure might necessarily not support having people coming, be it because of geographical limitations or cultural boundaries or certain societal mores and whatnot. So join me on this, my Solivagant adventure behind the lens of documentary photography in Iran. My name is Yazdanfar. I'm a photographer and publisher. I currently divide my time between the US and the Middle East. In 2017, I made a decision which would alter the course of my life more than any other one's had up to that point. After I'd spent my entire adult life in the US, I chose to root up and go back to my place of birth, Iran, to reconnect with my family, culture, and traditions, either long lost or never learned in the first place. The decision was not made flippantly, as returning there after 3 decades and leaving everything familiar behind would be far from easy. Yet, when it was all said and done, it was organic in nature, and despite diligent planning, the final outcome rested in the hands of the universe. What in its inception was meant to be a voyage of self-discovery quickly morphed into a series of fantastic and exhilarating adventures in my mother country. From far-flung corners of the arid central deserts and thousand-year-old mosques to snow-capped volcanoes and coastal villages, I was exposed to whereabouts I thought only existed in storybooks and dreams. When you look at Iran as a whole, it's one of the cradles of civilization. Most people only know of a few sites. Persepolis is, of course, the standout, most famous for what Alexander the Great did to it. But if you look back to the Paleolithic era, the region of Persia has been inhabited off and on for over 100,000 years. And there are semi-permanent hunting settlements dating back to 10,000 BCE. My journeys have taken to all of these historic sites. There's quite a few left. But when I began this, my focus, as I was breaking through the ice, breaking through the cultural norms and everything, and learning how to talk to people, they're reacquainting myself with my motherland. I was just taking pictures of different places, different historic sites. I wasn't really focusing on the people. I was focusing on the beautiful architecture of our country. I want to talk a little bit about what started happening during the pandemic. I had gone back to Iran for the first time in 2017, first time since I was a child. 2017 through 2019, I traveled the country, crisscrossing it, came back to the US, and I had a series of 4 exhibitions, each growing in size and scope in 2019. And then as I intended on taking off and going back to Iran in 2020 and exploring some more, and hopefully capturing some images of the people, the pandemic hit, the world shut down. I was stuck in America, and now my mainstay, my bread and butter, was photography and a small fledgling book distribution and publishing business in Iran. And I was stuck for about 6 months. As soon as I could get a flight to the Middle East, I flew to the Middle East in 2020. And to this day, the height of the pandemic, 2020, has been the busiest year for travel for me. I had over 65 flights in 2020. Getting to Iran from North Carolina isn't as simple as it sounds. You have to take a bunch of flights, a bare minimum of 3 flights and 4 airports, each of them with their own logistics and problems, especially during the pandemic. This is a little shot of JFK in August of 2020. I was the only passenger the day I was flying. There was nobody in any airports. This is Hamad International in Doha, Qatar, busiest airport in the Middle East. Again, you notice maybe about 4 or 5 people there. The absence of people was haunting, but it provided a little bit of time for you to, reset, to reassess things, to realize what's important, to reframe things both in your mind and then behind the lens. This last shot you're seeing on your screen right now is the old TWA terminal at JFK, where Howard Hughes had his offices and has now been turned into a boutique hotel. Amidst the death and despair and the isolation of the pandemic, some wonderful opportunities will present themselves. Most of the airports were empty, but every so often you would have small moments like this. A whole crew from KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, who were in the TWA hotel at JFK, and we ended up doing an impromptu photo shoot behind the split flap display of the old hotel. I asked all the stewardesses if they would pose for me for a series of photos, and this is one of the results. 2020, when nothing was going on in Iran, as I was mentioning with the pandemic, I had 3 different major projects I worked at, and then some smaller ancillary travels. The first one was Isfahan and beyond, to explore in Isfahan province the underground fabric weaving workshops of Kashan. One was in the 2 provinces of Gilan and Mazandaran, bordering the Caspian coast, following the traditional fishing methods that have been done for centuries. And last but not least was the saffron harvest, but in North Khorasan. The epicenter of it is in South Khorasan. I did not have a chance to go there that year, but I spent a few weeks in 3 villages, Segombat, Siadasht, and Titkanlu. We'll begin with the fabric weaving workshops of Kashan in northern Isfahan province. All of the fabric that they use there is dyed in-house. There's different dye houses, and each dye house only dyes yarn in one color. This particular dye house was dyeing it in an indigo color. This is one of the old weaving workshops. This is one of 2 remaining out of 32 that were active just a couple of decades ago. It's almost a lost art form. As we were mentioning prior to this talk beginning, the new generation doesn't want to follow in the footsteps of their fathers. 1, there's no economic incentive, which is the driver for everything. And 2, there's not much glory to it. Everything's become westernized. With the advent of technology, we're all connected. And young people in different corners of the world see what young people in other corners of the world have, and that's what they want. This gentleman, Ahmad Agha, is the last practicing master. They call him the last of 32. He's the last of 32 masters who still practices this to this day. In this photo, he's 68 years old. He's now 70. I've seen him 3 different times, 3 different years when I visited there. He has 1 glass eye. He had open heart surgery before this photo was taken. He's been in this workshop since he was 10 years old. Every day he makes 1 piece of cloth approximately 1 meter by 2 meters, and he does the pattern from memory. There's no blueprint for it. He just knows what he's going to make that day. The machine is done by hand. He's also had surgery on his ankles to fix his tendons because, of course, it's assiduous work. These are the 2 pigeons that keep him company in his workshop every day. The one on the left with the tail feathers is a specific type of pigeon, the name of which I do not recall, unfortunately, but of course there's a big picture, a big culture of birding and keeping pigeons in the Middle East, dating back to the carrier pigeons. This pigeon in particular is one of the more expensive ones because of the plumage. This is a sampling of different things he's made on different days, then turned into scarves and shawls to be sold in boutiques throughout Kashan and other parts of the country. Every single thing you see in this photo was made by that gentleman's hands. I was in a small village called Darya Bished near the Sisangan forest in the central Mazandaran coast. And every day tourists would line up to see these groups of fishermen pull these nets in by hand. A boat would take the nets out. Another boat would follow that boat to make sure the net didn't get stuck at the muddy bottom. And when they would pull this net back in, this whole process would take about 3-4 hours for them to pull the net back in, sort out the catch, straighten out the net, dump it back on a boat, and then have that boat go out and throw the net back in and come back in. It goes on day or night, rain or shine, 24 hours a day. The way the fishing is done there is each group of fishermen is given a certain stretch of beach. They can go as far as they want, but they cannot go to their left. They cannot go to their right. So as fish tend to travel and don't stay stationary, one day the catch may be good, one day the catch may be non-existent. In addition to that, you have to understand after the fall of the Soviet Union, it's divided into 10 or so countries, the coast of the Caspian Sea. So there's a lot more countries pulling from it. There's a lot more poaching, and then there's overpopulation and pollution and all sorts of other problems on this stressed ecosystem. But on this day and in this time of year, these guys were having bountiful harvest, and all sorts of tourists would gather to watch them pull this out. Well, I started developing relationships with them, as I do for most of these photographic expeditions, by taking them sweets, taking them chai, listening to their stories. And after 3-4 days of joining them, they asked me to come on the boats with them and go out to sea with them. This is when they're pulling the nets in. And this is some of the catch. This is the world's largest inland sea. Saltwater fish can be found there. Of course, no sharks, but you find saltwater species that are endemic to this sea and the sea alone. Again, this is one of those things that's passed down from father to son. You'll see many generational fishermen there. Here's a father and son. Each person has a specific role. These guys were netters. These guys just take care of the net, repair the net, and put the net back together. These guys are from the old guard, so they have the privileged position of being on the boat to make sure the net is fine, and everybody else does the heavy lifting. They've done their share over the decades. And some of the catch from that day. This will go straight to the bazaar. If you were lucky enough, you could buy it at cost right there at the seaside. But again, some shots of the fishermen. And dusk, as I mentioned before, it continues. This is going to be put together on the tractor, loaded back on a boat, and then it will start again. The saffron harvest was interesting. I knew a little bit about it. Of course, I'd grown up eating different treats, tea and different stews and whatnot with saffron in it. But when you see how much work goes into making this spice happen, it really puts everything into perspective. While there were groups of men in some organized, larger factory farming operations, about 90% of the people that were doing the actual picking and sorting were women. A portion of this industry has slowly become automated, where there are sorting machines worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in the nearby city of Mashhad, where they will sort the flowers and separate the stigmas from the flowers. But still, the planting of them and the picking of them is 100% done by hand. There's no substitute for raw manpower, or in this case, woman power. These are the women that were migrant workers. For pennies a day, they were doing all of the picking. It takes about 75,000 flowers to make 1 pound of this spice, which is what makes it the most important spice and the most expensive spice in the world. If you notice behind them, the field has been picked clean, and you notice a field in the distance that is purple. The harvest itself takes about a month, month and a half, but every given field only blooms for 2 weeks. Meaning if this field here is flowering on a certain day, it's going to flower for those 2 weeks and those 2 weeks only. And it's almost magical. You have to pick the flowers that day, because if you don't, we call it leaves. They become slimy and you cannot separate them. So you have to pick the flowers that day and then clean the flowers that day. And in the morning when you wake up, the field is purple again. If you do not pick the flowers that day, the field will not flower the next day. During this time, as I was mentioning the field in the back, certain fields were going to waste because of COVID. There wasn't enough people to pick the flowers. So there were signs all throughout these villages where storekeepers would say, come pick the flowers from my field, I'll give you half of the crop. This gentleman is Ali Barzagai. He's one of the top exporters of saffron in Iran. This gentleman is revolutionizing part of the industry there by standardizing certain things. So he has the first permits to sell to Spain and China and the UAE from these particular villages. As you notice, all of his guys are in uniforms. The ladies you saw in the other photos, some of them are the wives or daughters of these men here, but still is segregated when they're picking. Men pick certain fields and women pick the other ones. At the end of the day, when all of the flowers are picked, they would go to a large bazaar in a local town by the name of Farouj. Here, you would go to one of many buyers, whichever one you were comfortable with, because the price was the same. It was like a stock market. The price was the same, whatever they would give you. And the market was dictated by the quality of the flowers and the amount of the harvest. You would sell your flowers and they would give you a check the subsequent day. From here, these flowers are loaded onto large trucks and shipped off to automated places where they would be separated either by hand, a sheer quantity of people doing it in a warehouse or factory, or the machines that I mentioned before. So from here, these would be going to Mashhad. This is one of the boys that was the sons of one of the local dealers who was kind enough to pose for a photo for me. He wasn't in school because of COVID. And this is in the home of one of the villagers that I stayed with, where I decided that I want to give it a hand and see how hard it was to separate these flowers. It's something that I'm glad I did. It's something that I don't think I'll ever do again. There were 6 of us, 5 of them, of course, being locals who knew what they were doing, and then me, who was more of a hindrance than a help. 6 of us with 2 kilos of saffron flour, which is about enough to fill, let's say, 2 large-sized pillowcases. We spent 6 hours cleaning these flowers, and it yielded 45 grams of saffron, and that's before it was dried. So at the end of it, it gave us 15 grams, which we split half-half. So a lot of work, little reward. You're talking about the most delicate spice in the world, and this is what people's hands look like after hours and hours of picking them. A small video to show you how the flowers are separated. If you look in the top left corner, that's what we're going for. Everything else is waste. Everything else is thrown away. In the middle, you'll see a plate with the threads that are lesser colored. Those are usually mixed in with lesser quality saffrons, but the negin or sargul is what you see in the top left corner, which is the pure red unbroken threads.
جمع کردن صبح زمین کوچیکه اما جمع کردن ببین زمینش چجوریه بعد باقی کشاورزی هم میبینی که چجوری بوده ولی امسال هر جوری شده باید اون زمین رو بکاریم
و کی باید بکارینش؟
بهار باید بکاریم برج 2 3
تا یه ساعت دیگه حرکت بکنیم.
2021, I was starting to focus a little bit more on the people in 2020, of course. In 2021, in a weird way, as I was mentioning, the pandemic gave me that opportunity, albeit from a safe distance, to connect with people because everybody was dying for connections with other people. So that facilitated some things for me becoming more comfortable behind the lens, me learning how to ask for permission, me learning that different villages in Iran, different areas in Iran, different areas anywhere have different sets of rules, and you always have to respect those. And if you come with a pure heart, if you come with a clean spirit, people are more amenable to opening up their lives, their private areas of their life, their families to you, their doors to you, and sharing their experiences, their meals, and their livelihood with you. So 2021 took me again to Shiraz and returned to Persepolis, and then outside of there to the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Bishapur. And afterwards, of course, to areas that still remain some of my favorite in Iran, which is the Gulf Coast of Iran. We'll begin with the Temple of Anahita. There's another one by this name in Kermanshah, but this one is the one in Bishapur, in the middle of the desert. For a place that is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it was eerily silent. Now, of course, the pandemic was waning a little bit at this time. I thought there would be thousands of tourists here, but aside from myself and my wonderful friend who planned this entire expedition, there was nobody else there. This is the entrance to the Temple of Anahita in the middle of the desert. This is wall carvings in a place called Tangachogan, which is the ancient grounds where polo was first played. Another angle of the same. And a little tour from the temple of Anahita. Anahita, of course, is an ancient Persian goddess, a goddess of life and fertility, who I have used as an inspiration for the name of my current series of exhibitions, which we'll get into a little bit later in this talk. But for now, possibly my favorite destination when I go to the Persian Gulf Coast is this small island. The first time I ended up there, I ended up here by accident. I was intending on going to the neighboring island of Qeshm. Qeshm is the largest island in the Middle East. It is a few hours with a vehicle from one tip of the island to the other. It has some of the most surreal and alien landscape I've ever seen or ever thought of. And I knew that I couldn't explore it in a few days. So I had intended on going there for a couple of weeks. Lo and behold, before I intended on going there, a couple of friends of mine say, hey, why don't you go to Rainbow Island, Rainbow Island? They keep repeating this. And these are foreign friends. These are not Iranians. And they keep saying they've heard of this magical place called Rainbow Island. Why don't you go there? And I looked it on a map and I saw they were referring to this small hamlet of Hormuz, which is 42 square kilometers, 20 square miles or so. And so I realized that to get to that small island, because I had to fly to the southern Persian Gulf Coast, that I would not be able to access it as easily as Qeshm, which has its own international airport and ferries running every half hour, every hour. So my idea was to make it easier for myself, since I was renting a hotel in the town of Qeshm, on the island of Qeshm, is that I would go to the southern tip of the coast to a port city called Bandar Abbas on the Persian Gulf Coast. I would see when the ferry was to go to Hormuz. I'd go to Hormuz. I'd stay there one day, because most tours said you only need to stay there half a day to see this tiny little island. And from there, I would get a boat and I would go to Qeshm. I'd spend a couple of weeks in Qeshm and I would fly back to Tehran, where I reside. Well, the trips had another plan lined up for me that I didn't know at that time. And what it was is me ending up in Hormuz and falling in love with it and spending a couple of weeks there, not having enough time to go to Qeshm and then just going back to Tehran from there. The next trip I was going to go to Tabriz, and I thought Tabriz is in the northwest part of the country. It's going to be a little cold. I got to the airport, ripped up my ticket, bought another ticket to Bandar Abbas, and went back to Hormuz. Every time I would try to go anywhere else, I would end up on this island. And the primary driver, beyond some of the images you're going to see, was all of the people that you see here. The transportation on this island is strictly three-wheelers. There's no cars there. gentleman you saw in the last video, and most of the girls that are in that video, that is Abdullah and some of his daughters. I say some of his daughters because he has 6, 7 kids. He's now become a friend. He's a fisherman part-time, which is the only industry on a small island. And the rest of the time, those few years when it's not hellishly hot and tourists come to the island, he's a tour guide. He's the best guy to show you around Hormuz, the ins and outs of it, or the mountaintops, the peaks, the caves, and a little bit about the history and the culture. This is one of the shots from the beautiful coast of Hormuz. If you notice in the foreground, there's a couple of orange little spheres. Those are oranges. A lot of times when there's squalls or storms in the Persian Gulf, cargo ships, depending on where they're coming from, headed towards the Emirates or Oman from Iran, or coming back with some other wares from that side to the Iranian coast. Once if they capsize or if things fall overboard, the sea, of course, brings them to the shores. And a lot of times the bounty is fruit. And in Hormuz, they call these portugal daryai, sea oranges. So the call will go out through the village that there is sea oranges, and all the villagers would rush to the shore to get free oranges out of the water. It's a bit comical to me, but they were delicious. Just had to peel the skin off, of course. This was my mode of transportation when I first went there. You can talk to locals. There's not a rental agency per se, but you can get a motorcycle from somebody to get yourself around the island. And there's a road that rings the island, and the inside of it is made of salt domes. They say the soil of Hormuz is 72 colors. I've yet to count, but I've seen at least a couple dozen. Here's a sampling of that. This, to give it perspective, this is about a square foot or 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters, the middle part of it. And you see about a dozen colors in there. The island itself, the geology of it, the island has taken 300 million years to form this island. But it's a relatively young island, having only come out of the Persian Gulf over the past 50,000 years due to tectonic plate activity. This is a very seismically active zone. I have been in 3 or 4 different earthquakes myself when I've been on this island. I took a boat ride out with some of the shrimpers, following some of the other shrimpers around. They get up early in the morning. They fish from dawn till noon or so because it becomes unbearably hot after that. This is one of the many shrimp boats. This is a small project that was built as an ecologically friendly project. If it is so, it remains to be seen, but it's called Majera. It is based on the architecture style of a gentleman who was the founder of the California Earth Institute by the name of Nader Khalili, a famous Iranian architect. He has now passed on, but the architects who designed this took inspiration from his designs and designed this as a mixed-use center. And they pulled local craftsmen and then local villagers to teach them new trades and crafts to build this place. It's supposed to be accessible to all. It's been closed since it was built. I don't know. I've heard rumors that it's open back up now. Some of it is residential, and then some of it is supposed to be mixed use. But again, I don't know how accessible it is to everybody. There's mixed feelings about whether this is an eyesore or whether this adds to the uniqueness of the island. But here it is. As I was mentioning, the island is comprised of many salt domes. So once it rains, the little bit that it does rain, the rain trickles out from the central mountains of the island all the way to the coast and carries the salt with it. That water is so viscous because of the salt content. Over there, you see my motorcycle in the background, and in the middle of your frame, you see a round object right about here. This round object is a tire that somebody unfortunately disposed of in here. But the reason I'm focusing on this, beyond the fact that nobody should throw trash in nature, of course, is that this tire was visible 4 days before that. But the salt content is so high that as soon as you put your hand in the water, salt crystals start forming on it. This is a little friend I found before I almost stepped on him. There's a ton of rays by the coast. And this is the traditional form of transportation in Hormuz. This one is an Italian version, I think. It's a Maserati, so it probably goes faster than the other ones. And there's a map of Old Hormuz on the building behind it. There's groups of artists that come to the island every year for beautification in exchange for lodging or a little bit of food or whatnot. They work on beautifying the island by painting these wonderful murals on all the buildings. The whole island is covered with murals. There's Portuguese forts that dot the southern coast of Iran. This is again the one on Hormuz. This is actually one of the largest ones I've seen because there's one on Besh, there's one in Chabahar, there's one in Bandar Kor and other places. The Portuguese ruled the seas, the southern coast of Iran in particular, around the 16th century. So this is the Portuguese fort there, and it's a wonderful place for exploration. And atop the Portuguese fort, you can get a view of the quote-unquote downtown of Hormuz, the minaret of one of the mosques, and some of the mountains and the salt domes as you see in the background. This is a Socotra cormorant. These are migratory birds. There's a lot of these birds that are migratory that come from Africa or from North Asia and land in our Pearl Islands in the Persian Gulf. We have about close to 40 islands, all of them sovereign Iranian territory, despite what you may have heard from others. And on all of these islands, you have different species of birds endemic to other regions that pass through every so often. This is a Socotra cormorant. The Socotra is an island belonging to Yemen, about 80 miles off the coast of Somalia, about 130, 140 kilometers off the coast of Somalia. And these birds pass through and land in Iran every winter. This is inside one of the small salt caves in the island. This is one of the more constrictive and claustrophobic, if you're not used to it, caves. You have to get on your belly and crawl through sand and silt and salt and water to get through, but you're presented with this ghostly, miniature, otherworldly scene when you get inside it. This is a different part of the island. Again, another one of the salt rivers. This one is called the Saffron River. You notice the color of this, it looks like lava. As I was mentioning before, different minerals, different salts, 72 different supposed colors. So different rivers in Hormuz have different colors depending on what salt dome they emanate from. And this one is a Saffron River. If you do visit there, please make sure you do not step on these salts. They're very brittle. Unfortunately, that's been a problem in the past few years. Some of these photos, when people ask where they were taken, I'm hesitant to tell them exactly where on the island. And local guides, most of them, at least 80, 90% of them, such as Abdullah that I was mentioning before, know better than to take everybody there because unfortunately, we, as a whole, do not respect nature as much as we should. Small detail of one of the other salt rivers or rivulet here. This is the inside of the Rainbow Cave. This is not photoshopped. And as a note, I do not Photoshop anything. Photoshop does have its place. I do adjust contrast and lighting and vignetting and things like that, sharpness, maybe saturation on my photos. But I try to do as much as I can, SOOC, straight out of camera. I want to take people to where I was. I want them to see it exactly how I remember it. Because I think if the image is done right and presented right, it can transport you to that place without actually being there. This is the inside of the Rainbow Cave. Remember when I was telling you that the island is all these different colors? This is underneath the island. And this shows you the different striations, the different levels that are pushing their way up to the top of the island. This is yet another one of the salt caves. All of the stalactites and stalagmites here look like they were waves. It was like being inside of a tsunami, but frozen in time. This is my guide, Abdullah, and I in one of the inner chambers of the Rainbow Cave. I have him in here for size. The chambers get smaller and smaller. This is the middle chamber, the last one you cannot stand up straight in. This is coming around one of the seamounts. This is a sea cave that you can access when the tide is low. The tide is high here, so you cannot see inside of it. But when the tide is low, smugglers will go in here and put their wares in there and hide it from the Iranian Navy and the guards. And then they go when it's safe. They make sure that they haven't been followed. They bring illegal things, tobacco and other things from the Emirates and Oman and some of the Gulf states. And they hide their wares in these sea caves around the island. There's a tradition of pirates and smugglers and all sorts of things that has permeated the local culture here for the past few centuries. Traditional garb of one of the local women. these masks are now mostly worn a little bit for modesty, also for beauty. But dating back to when the Portuguese were here on these islands, there were different reasons for these masks being worn. And one of them, of course, was to keep the sun out of your eyes. The second one with the masks was because they would wear more plain, was not as decorated as you see now. Because when the idea was that when the Portuguese would pass by on their ships, they would mistake the women for men and they wouldn't attack them. And these women that you're seeing in these photos, I've met them over and over and over as they've opened up to me. Now they allow me to take photos of them outside of their comfort zones, such as taking them out onto the cliffs of this wonderful, colorful island and doing longer photo shoots in places that they may not normally go with outsiders. One of my favorite quotes about photography from the New York Times photographer, Sam Falk: to tell the story completely and instantly. One photo captures just a moment in time. There's people that say photography isn't real. But for what it is, for that moment, if done correctly, you can completely transport somebody with just one image. A lot of times when people describe their process, both technically as well as creatively, they tend to get wrapped up with the numbers and settings with their equipment. There's no denying that you have to use the right lens or camera for a given type of work, nor can you ignore your shutter speed, f-stops, ISO, etc. But equally as important as the technique is what drives you to capture an image and what information you're trying to convey to the viewer. More often than not, I find myself focusing on the mood I'm trying to share, on the sense of place, rather than pixel peeping or maintaining front-to-back sharpness. I use the medium of photography to tell a tale. I want to whisk the viewer away to the world I'm experiencing, to pluck them out of their surroundings and drop them in the kaleidoscopic landscape of my home country, and let them form their own ideas about an oft misunderstood corner of the world. I showed you some of the behind the scenes images, and this is the result of some of those expeditions. This is some of the images from 2017 to 2020 that have been shown in some of my series of exhibitions stateside. This is a gentleman outside the Dome of Sultaniye. This is one of the boats in Gilan. Ziba Kenar is the name of the town. This is after a squall. They decide to give a break to the fishing. This is the largest mosque in the world, the Imam Reza Mosque. His shrine is inside this mosque. There's about a dozen or so large yards in here. This is larger than the mosque in Mecca. At full worship, this mosque can hold close to 600,000 worshippers. This is one of the mosques in the Naqsh Jahan Square in Isfahan. Across from this mosque is the Ali Rabu Palace. So this mosque a few hundred years ago was only for the king's harem. You'll notice that unlike other mosques, it does not have the prayer towers or the minarets. And the reason for it was because the only people to go up in the prayer towers to say the prayer calls are men, and this was for the king's harem. Hence, it was only for women, and they did not need a prayer tower. This is a full photo of the trusty workhorses, the old Mercedes trucks that have been used since before the revolution, 43 years ago, to transport salt out of the salt mines in the central salt flats of the Kebir Desert, the largest desert in central Iran. This is another mosque, the Shah Abbas Mosque, or the Imam Mosque as it's known now, again in Naqsh Jahan, which is the central square in Isfahan. And this is one of my favorite mosques. This is the Agha Bozorg Mosque in Kashan. It is lit up as such at night. Again, this shot was taken during the pandemic, so it was empty. Normally it would be full at this time of the night, but very picturesque. Reminds me of the Tales of 1001 Nights or Scheherazade from my childhood. My dear friend Ahmad Agha behind his loom, a little candid shot of him. And the famous alleys of the desert city of Yazd, known as Ashti Konan. We translate them in English to friendship alleys. It's not quite what it means. Ashti is when you have a falling out with somebody and become friends again. So the meaning is the alley where you become friends again, Ashti Konan. So these friendship alleys, basically the idea behind it is that the alleyways are so narrow that when two of you are passing by each other, where you will rub against each other because only one person can pass at a time. Hence, you have to put aside your differences and work through your problems if you want to be in the alley at the same time. This is one of the dye houses I was telling you about before. Notice I said each dye house only dyes one color of yarn, this one indigo. And if you notice, their meal is in the forefront. There's a little watermelon in the photo right here. This is one of the alleyways of the Vakil Bazaar in Shiraz, one of the oldest, most beautiful bazaars I've seen in Iran. Back in the day, beasts of burden would carry all of the wares throughout the bazaars, donkeys and mules and whatnot. And now that has been to a great part been replaced by motorcycles. There are no rules of transportation within the bazaar, so you really need to watch out when these motorcycles are zooming by at 30, 40 kilometers an hour. But this is how things are taken from one end of the bazaar to the other. A shot of some of the fishermen in Ziba Kenar. The other fishermen I was showing you earlier in the small video were in Mazandaran. This is Gilan province. A little squall was rolling in, so they were trying to get the net in. Small village of Kang, again in North Khorasan. After I got the saffron harvest, I went to visit this village. This village sits on an earthquake fault line. Every village around this village has been hit by earthquakes. This village, depending on who you ask, they say between 1,000 to 2,000 years has been inhabited as such, yet nothing has ever happened to it. This village is inaccessible during the winter. It's only accessible during the warmer months. The large central building you see close to the mosque is the school. They have to bring teachers in every fall. The teachers have to stay there till the next year because once it starts snowing, nobody can access the village. So the teachers stay in the village till the next spring when they can go back home. This is the grandson of one of the older ladies that was picking saffron. Of course, he was not in school because of the pandemic. He was kind enough to pose for a small photo for me and decided to put these flowers in front of his eyes. You see his hands stained from the flowers. The Gomad Sultaniya, the largest freestanding brick dome in the world. This is part of this town was the capital of the Ilkhanid Empire, which is an offshoot of the Mongols. A small sunseeker lizard. This is in Persepolis. I was walking around for many hours that day, had the place to myself. Every time I would look back, there was one lizard behind me, following me around, and finally he jumped on a column. I'd like to think it was the same lizard. I'm sure there were different ones, but I like to tell myself that it was the same guy following me around all day. One of the larger merchant houses in Kashan. This is Khane Tabatabai, the Tabatabai house, named after the family of the same name. These homes had ornate courtyards, and they belonged to the merchants of these towns. There's 3 of them in this house. The Burujerdi and this one were open the year I went. So ringing the courtyard, they have these large rooms with stained glass windows. Half of the rooms are one side of the courtyard, half on the other side. Half of them are summer domicile, half are the winter residence, depending on which side the sun's coming in. In the summer, they stay in the cooler rooms. In the winter, they stay in the ones that are warmer. This is a procession in downtown Tehran, close to the bazaar. This is for Ashura and Tasua, the commemoration of Imam Hussein, his martyrdom in Karbala. So these are recreations and commemorations. There's large religious groups called Hayats, and the more money they have, of course, the more ornate and involved processions they have. So this one, of course, has brought in some camels and dressed everybody as mourners. A neat scene to capture in a modern city. This is when I was on the boats in the Caspian Sea. We're a few miles offshore, coming back to the shore after we have dropped the net. And then the net will be pulled in by hand by the gentleman that you saw in the earlier photos. This again is during the pandemic. Is the Vakil Mosque, close to the namesake Bazaar, the Vakil Bazaar, which was built during the Zand dynasty a few hundred years ago. I was waiting till after the afternoon prayer so I could get a shot of just the columns. This gentleman came and started praying. I asked if I could take a photo while he was there, and I think he really balances the shot. This is one of the more unique things I've encountered in Iran. This is a group of, this is a Iranian motorcycle gang, very handsome fellows. If you ask for a motorcycle gang out of central casting for a movie, I'm assuming this is the guys they would send you. So I was trying to go from Persepolis to Pasargad. I think I took a left where I should have taken a right and ended up at this desert oasis. I was trying to ask directions of how to get there, and this motorcycle gang comes rolling in. You see the dust first, you hear the rumble of their Harley Davidsons, and then you see them. Everything they've learned, or a good part of it, has a mimicry of Western culture and what they see a motorcycle gang being, something from West Side Stories, I think. Their jackets have the 1% patches, which is something popularized in the 50s and 60s in America when AAA said that 1% of all bikers were outlaws. And these guys, the bikers in America, such as the Hells Angels and the Mongols and whatnot, took that to heart and proudly displayed 1% patches on their jackets. Well, these guys have adopted the same. In Iran, we have provinces in lieu of states. It's the same thing. So these guys on their jackets have Pars province on the front of their jackets, and on the back, the city from which they hail from, which is Shiraz. The name of their gang is called the Cataphracts. Cataphracts are the old armored divisions that in both Persian and Roman armies existed over 1,000 years ago. They were called the Cataphracts, and this is what these guys have called themselves. I asked the gentleman who's in the back, who's not wearing a mask, I said, can I take your photo? He was the boss. He said, sure, you can, as long as everybody's facing away from the camera. They were the friendliest guys I've ever met. Their Instagram is amazing. They go to different historic sites such as Persepolis, Nakhsar-Rostam, Takht Jamshid, places like that, and they pose in front of these millennial-old artifacts and take photos. They're the most archaeologically minded, cleanest cut motorcycle gang I've ever run across. This is from the Masjid Jami in Isfahan. Depending on the colors and the patterns, depending on the dyes you see in the tile work, you can tell what period everything was made from, because certain materials were geographically available in certain areas, and certain techniques, of course, were done at certain times. A shot of the women. Again, as I mentioned, these are shots that I've used in my exhibition. So you saw some of the behind the scenes stuff and then the final product. This is, again, the group of women picking the flowers. Moving on to 2021. Some of the shots that I took then. This is a deceiving picture. It looks like one of the small boats from the northern part of Iran, but this is about 100 feet or 30 meters long. This is Lenj, an old, one of the old handmade wooden boats that traverse the seas to this day in the Persian Gulf. This one is in its final rest. They now, ones such as this that are on the coast provide artificial reefs. So if you want to do some snorkeling, these are the best places because it's full of fish. This is Cargo Headlands. This is a workshop where they are still making these on the coast. The blueprint for these large ships, again, this is not, looks like a small toy boat, but this is about 100 feet long, as I mentioned. The blueprints from these boats is passed down from father to son, again, just as many of the other things such as weaving. There is no written blueprint from the late 17th century, early 18th century onwards to this day. There's a person that's called the Ostad, or the master, and he overlooks the construction of this. It's becoming more and more cost prohibitive to make them out of wood because the wood is teak and other exotic woods that are hardwoods that last longer in the oceans. So they make a lot of them out of fiberglass. Fiberglass tends to be lighter, cheaper, but it has a higher risk of catching on fire. So the preferred way is still making them like this. And this boat, this is in the middle of daytime. That's why you don't see a crew working on it, because it is forbidding heat, about 45 to 50 degrees Celsius, about 120 or so in Fahrenheit. But they were working earlier that morning, and basically a boat like this takes 4 or 5 years to complete. This is a small city called Bandar-e-Loft on the island of Qesh. The structures you see atop the buildings are something we see in the central deserts in Iran, and then of course on the Gulf Islands. They're called badgir, or wind catchers. They're the world's first and foremost and still functional systems of air conditioning. They are positioned as such where the Gulf breezes come in from one side, they go down and they circulate through the house and they come out the other way, and they cool down the ambient temperature by about 20 degrees. This is when I was coming back from my boat ride around the island photographing the seamounts and sea caves in Hormuz and neighboring Larak Island. This is a view of one of the main boulevards in downtown Hormuz. As you notice, there's little solar panels and the weather vanes up top. They really are giving it a good effort to try to maintain the history of the island while still being forward-minded and open thinking to preserve what they have there and keep it for the future generations. The fishing fleet in the small port town of Bandar Kong. Bandar Kong is where you are seeing the images of the workshops where the lenj or those traditional sea vessels were being built. Hormuz Island, as mentioned before, the shrimpers would go out early in the morning and come back at noon. Over here in Bandar Kong, they do quite the opposite. These boats go into deeper water and they leave at night and they fish all night. And when it becomes hot the next morning, they come back. The difference is the fishermen in Bandar Kong here go to what's called Abozurg in their local dialect, and the fishermen in Hormuz go to Abkuchik. So Abozurg means big water and Abkuchik means little water. So in essence, those guys go to shallow offshore reefs and surrounding areas of the islands, whereas these guys go into the more dangerous parts where there's stronger currents and possibilities of storms coming out of nowhere about 30, 40 miles offshore in the middle of the Persian Gulf. This is just a scene from the harbor at Hormuz where we docked our boat. And this is the completed shot after we had done a study shot. So basically when I do location scouting, some places, if time allows and resources are available, I try to do a scouting to see where the light is coming from, what the best shot would be, and then go back and take the shots. When I mentioned that sea cave at high tide, this is the completed shot of it when I revisited it. This is a place called Chaku. It is a series of chasms that are formed by wind and erosion in the middle of two cliffs on the island of Gesh. This haunting photo is one of my favorite. The island of Hormuz has about 70% iron oxide in the soil. So this area that you're looking at right now before was one of the central mines for this ore. For centuries, there's this here, and I believe there's one in Spain where this ore is prevalent, and this is used for medicinal purposes, but primarily for making pigments and dyes for painting. It was highly sought after all through Europe. And so one of the main export of this island from the Portuguese time onwards has been this red soil. Now they've realized that this is a finite resource and they put a stop to it. And now there's talks of reviving the island again because the economy's tanked, between the sanctions and the pandemic and the lack of tourism and everything. But I'm hoping that they'll stick with what they've decided, which is they put a halt to mining operations. And this place has now become a tourist overlook. There's a cliff about 20 to 30 meters, about 100 feet that drops off on the edge of it. You can see the Gulf way in the distance, and way, way in the distance, the shadow of the island of Desh. And so this is in the off season. This is smack in the middle of August where nobody would go out there. For photography, it was beautiful though, and I was out there. These booths, as you notice, they're all stained red. These booths go up every year, and they were new a few months ago, but the weather here is harsh. These are the Badlands. So they're weather beaten, the wind has destroyed them, but they will come up with new booths, which will sell trinkets, made out of seashells and whatnot, little bottles full of the colorful soil of the island, layered, with patterns in them, cold drinks and ice cream and whatnot. And of course, some of the local clothing. This is a view of what's called Rainbow Valley on the island of Hormuz. Again, as I mentioned, a multitude of colors in the island. Now, understand that in this shot, there has been no rain on the island for 2 years. So everything has that ochre tint because that's the prevalent color. So if it rains, you will see some of the blues and some of the violets and some of the other colors. But right now, predominantly, you see the golds and the browns and the bronzes and a little bit of the red. And underneath that wonderful valley, this is a shot of the Rainbow Cave. So it's a little bit of a hike. But if you do make it here, and I hope you all do, definitely ask for Abdullah and definitely try to make it to Rainbow Cave. Now here, you actually can see that there can be 72 colors, if not more, on Hormuz. This is another one of my favorite shots. This is on the port of Guran, another Kargo and Lenj, another place where they make those wonderful boats. This was a boy waiting for his father to come back from the sea. And the sun and the boats provided for a perfect framing of his silhouette in the evening sun in the Persian Gulf. I titled this part Uncertain Destinations, everything that happened in 2022 and 2023. Sometimes despite all the planning in the world, you are not able to go to the destinations you want, so you pivot. Fortunately, our motherland is one of the most culture-rich and diverse places on Earth. It is definitely the most beautiful place that I've explored, and I've been on every continent except for Australia, which I hope to get to soon. I will say, I should say Oceania, not Australia, but at any extent. This is just an amalgam of some of the photos that I managed to take last year. I began in Gilan when I couldn't go to some other provinces. So I began in the northwest part of the country in the mountain village of Masouleh. It's a wonderful hamlet. If you look closely, Masouleh is unique. It's one of the many steppe villages in Iran. You saw Kang earlier. There's about a dozen or so peppering all of Iran. But this is the most famous one and the most tourist-oriented one because it's one of the most accessible. And if you notice, you'll see people walking on the roof. So the roof of one house is the front yard of the house above it. And it's something that people are just accustomed to. Every day a fog rolls in this village, and it is wonderful. This is the afternoon fogs that envelop this whole village every day. And as it rolls in more and more, you cannot see but for a few feet in front of you. And then at night, the village comes to life. The bazaar is on multiple different levels, and it's started with cafes where you can smoke hookah, or galyun as we call it. Music emanates from every corner, and the people are very friendly. Again, another view of the bazaar at night. And a little hyperlapse. This in real time, this is about 10 to 12 minutes, but it's compressed into a few seconds. A trip through the bazaar in Masouleh. So now, move into South Khorasan province. This is in a village called Naiban. It's in the middle of the desert. This is the area where the remaining dozen or so cheetahs, Persian cheetahs, Asiatic cheetahs are. We did not have the good fortune of seeing one of those despite our best intentions, but we saw different animals, gazelle family animals throughout the hills surrounding this place. This is a very unique village. Again, it is so far from everywhere. They have their own dialect. There's no bakery in town. I wouldn't call it a struggle. We had to ask different villagers if they could provide us with some bread because everybody makes their own. This was a view from the place we stayed overnight. What looks to be a body of water in the distance is actually the desert. This is why I was telling you the village is unique. If you take a look, this is in the middle of the desert. It is surrounded by palm trees and orange groves. Some of the sweetest oranges I had in this desert. Another view of the desert. You'll see this tire suspended here in the halfway down the screen on the right side. The reason I point this out is because the major economy here, the major driver for people that are there, unless they're farmers, they are all truck drivers. The entire province, so the entire state of South Khorasan, hinges on this village's truckers. So they had a little tongue-in-cheek joke that they told us. They said, if we all go on strike, the entire state comes to a halt because all the truck drivers live in this village. This is another village on the Tabas side of South Khorasan province. This village is called Esfak. So a small story, about 50 years ago, there was an earthquake in South Khorasan province, and in the city of Tabas, a larger city, about half the population passed away, tens of thousands of people. This village is about an hour or so outside that, a couple hours outside that city. But this village lost about a quarter of its residents, 20 to 25%. And what happened was everybody, because these are 400-year-old adobe homes, they decided to move to the desert and sleep outside in tents because they were worried about aftershocks and the roofs caving in on them and more death and destruction. So after 2-3 years, the government stepped in and built them a brand new village, modern homes with brick and metal and everything else. They never returned to this village. The generation after the earthquake, the sons and the daughters of those, they came back to the paternal homes, as we call Khane Pedari, and a few of them got together, in a sense, created a co-op. And so far, they've restored 8 of the homes, a bathhouse and the mosque, and a small cultural shop with different items. And what they have done is, in essence, they've made it a system. The best way I can explain it is, imagine a collection of B&Bs, where if one of them fills up, the overflow goes to the second house, and so on and so forth. So they all work together and they all reap the benefits of it. Again, when my friend who had planned this expedition and I went here, we were the only travelers in this village for the time that we were there. So it is wonderful. It's a place frozen in time. At night, you can hear wildlife outside surrounding it. And in the daytime, you have the village to yourself. It is warm in the daytime and forbiddingly cold at night when we went there in the winter, because it's a desert and the temperature fluctuates wildly. But again, you see a little bit of agriculture going on around, palm trees, and then a shot of the village itself and the beautiful mountains surrounding it. Another shot of the village. You can see here in the distance one of the restored homes, and then, of course, the rest of them in the same state they've been in since being frozen in time in the earthquake. Desert sunsets are always some of the most beautiful. And nighttime in the village of Esfak. Again, we're going to do one more hyperlapse. This one is a walkthrough of the village you just saw. Uh-oh. Technical difficulties. Let's see. Here we go. Now we move on to the current project, my series of exhibitions that I'm doing with dealing with now. The last one ended a couple months ago. I'm off to Iran to hopefully explore some other things about the country and also add to the collection of images to expand on this exhibition as it is a traveling show, and there's 2 other bookings already slated for 2024 and beyond. This is a photo of one of the women picking saffron and another. These are companion pieces. Note the juxtaposition between the roughness of her hands and the most expensive spice in the world. Images of the women on the south coast of Iran in their daily garb. You can see the difference between the masks. Now, people that are more well-versed than I am can tell you, depending on the shape of the mask and the form of the mask, where these people are from. So, for example, this woman is from Loft, and you can tell that she resides on the island of Beshman. She is from Loft based on the shape of what she's wearing. Part of one of the photo shoots a couple of years ago. Again, you've seen, if you do a Google search and put in burqa, Gulf burqa, or batulas is what they really are, you know, the southern mask, you know, burqa haike, madari munja. On the Persian Gulf Coast, you'll see a lot of women in the bazaars and everything, but to get them to, you know, trust you enough to follow you and come out to these cliff sides and, you know, put on these masks in places where they would normally travel to themselves was a bit of a task, but, you know, I think the images are well worth the result. This is a beautiful village in South Khorasan province. It is called Chenesht. This village has had its own particular clothing for about 500 years. If you do a search of this village online, you will see the same 10 images repeated on a myriad of websites, because it is a very closed society and they do not allow their women to be photographed, and the women themselves do not want to be photographed. This photo came about after we had met a person who was local to this village. We had met him through some contacts in Birjand, and they had him come pick us up in a neighboring village. And even in the neighboring village, they were asking us, why are you guys going to Chenesh? Nobody goes there, because there's nothing going on here, you know. I mean, the village keeps to themselves. They all marry amongst each other. And the only reason I was able to get this shot is because this young lady is about 10 years old or so. Her sister, who was about 14 or 15, I was not allowed to take photos of because she was off to be married. You'll notice around her head, she has all of these coins. This is thousands of dollars worth of coins. These are from the Qajar dynasty a couple hundred years ago, these silver coins. And from the time she's born all the way till she's given away as a bride, coins are added to this as part of her dowry. This is another photograph of the clothing in the village of Chenesh. As you notice, there's no face in this. There's a larger story to this image, but that story involves all of my travels over the past couple of years. The reason this story exists is the reason these travels exist, and the reason these travels exist is the reason this photo exists. This is one of my favorite people. This is an older woman, the mother of a young lady who was cooking the local thin bread that we ate every day on the island of Hormuz. She was kind enough to pose for me when I was getting my daily fix. I photographed her many different days. This is some of the henna work on the hands of one of the girls I photographed on the island of Hormuz. And yet another one of the girls on the island of Hormuz. There's a younger generation. You saw some of the older women, but some of the younger generation have embraced her culture, and they are also very adamant about preserving their traditional clothing, their traditional way of life, and their traditional music and culture and everything else. You'll notice the water here is tinted red. As I mentioned before, the island of Hormuz is 70% iron oxide. So whenever there's a storm or there's a wind, the entire Persian Gulf turns red around the island. This is the village of Masule, which you saw earlier. This is a woman in traditional Qasim Awadi clothing. There's 3 or 4 major different types of clothing in the province of Gilan, and this is Qasim Awadi, as is this image as well. Going back to the island of Hormuz, and I had mentioned earlier that all of the island walls have murals on them. This is one of the murals. This was on the way to a photo shoot. It just worked out well that the young lady that I was working with had the same clothing as the woman on the wall. All of the women on this island tended to have very unique and poetic last names. This young lady's last name was Oj Hormozi, which meant wave of Hormuz. Another one was Darya Nabard, seafarer. Another one was Darvishi, of a dervish. And yet another one was Azadi, freedom. So very unique last names. All of them fit the island. This image is one of my favorites. It's a bit haunting. This was one of the first images I took on the island of Hormuz. Again, you see the sea tinged with that hue of red. And it's part of a 2-image series. The second one being this one. The idea was that the second one showed the spirit leaving the body. Again, as a backdrop, the domes that I mentioned before, the buildings. The reasoning behind these expeditions and these exhibitions is when you make these community connections, like having the exhibitions, doing lectures and associate programs, these contribute to an environment in which constructive engagement and mutual understanding between the people of Iran and the US and other places can occur. Transporting guests and patrons to places that they may otherwise not have an opportunity to experience highlights not only the differences in our lifestyles, but also the myriad ways in which we see all the same things. By drawing attention to cross-cultural similarities, we become closer, more understanding and accepting of each other. I'd mentioned the difficulties of getting to Iran under normal circumstances, much less when there's a pandemic or other things going on. This is a little bit to put it into perspective of how much of my travels have taken me between just here and there. This does not include travels out to other countries. This is by the numbers for Iran. You know, about 140,000 kilometers by plane. And then all the other things, all the way down to how many kilometers by foot. Photos taken, that's a rotating count. I don't know how many, I'm not claiming any of the images are good, much less the total amount. But I've taken somewhere in the vicinity of 240,000 photos of the Middle East over the past 7 years. I want to thank everybody, beginning with the Khane Iran South Bay Persian Heritage Foundation, Ms. Atusa, and definitely Ms. Qudsi Madani for facilitating this talk for me. Mr. Mehdi Amamian from the Iranian Cultural Society of North Carolina for introducing me to the South Bay Persian Heritage Foundation. And especially my family in Iran, without whom this ongoing journey of self-discovery wouldn't have been possible without them. May this revolution around the sun be filled with lots of adventures, prosperity, and love. A Rumi quote, don't be satisfied with stories, how things have gone with others, unfold your own myth. This is an image from Restless Anahita. The collection of images is the current collection of images. I purposefully did not show you some of those images. Those images are not online. If you do a search of my name, C.A. Yazdanfar, you will see multiple articles, be it TV, newspaper, radio, that will have other aspects of my story, spoken as other people understand it, which is always nice to get a different perspective on what you're doing. But the reason I put this here at the end is because there are some beautiful images that I was not able to share with you this evening. However, if you would be kind enough to recall or write down this email address, contact@cayazdanfar.com. I would love to tell you about future programs that I'm doing in different corners of the world, the ones I'm doing in the US when I come back in 2024. And as a small thank you, when you send me an email, I will send you a password to what is called a private viewing room on my website, which will give you access to the entire collection of the images from Restless Anahita as they stand so far. Travel brings power and love back into your life. I hope you all get to travel as much as you want to. I hope you get to come to your motherland, come back to your motherland, And I hope this talk has lifted your spirits, and I'm happy that I've been able to share a little bit about my experiences reacquainting myself with my birthplace. And I want to thank all of you for letting me share this with you. Thank you.
Wow. This was incredible. اولا تبریک بهتون میگم. Congratulations for what you decided to do. But again, you had a comfortable life here in the United States for 30 years, and then you decided to go back to Iran. Do what you love to do, and we love to see it. And I wish you the best. و انشالله بازم مهمون ما خواهید بود وقتی برگردید.
مرسی.
I can't wait to see the others. و چقدر زیبا بود. چقدر زیبا بود. جنوب ایران به خصوص. اون خونه هایی که توی دزرت زیر تبس بودن. من مطمئنم، من خودم البته دلم میخواست که الان اونجا بودم و probably most of you too. hopefully میتونیم بریم اینا رو ببینیم و I don't know, it's just breathtaking. من هر مسافرت زیاد میرم ولی هر کشوری رو که میرم همونجا وای میستم میگم از ایران جای قشنگتر نیست. ولی متاسفانه توریسممون it's dead for now. چند سال پیش که من ایران بودم اروپایی ها می اومدن ولی الان دیگه نمیدونم. Oh, I don't know که چجوری how to thank you.
خواهش میکنم.
I know that your time was obviously very precious and going to Iran in a few days, and keep in touch. I will definitely bother you.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone. Thank you for being with us.